Good afternoon. My name is Richard Marks, and I'd like to welcome you to the fourth in a series of noon lectures sponsored by the Chancellor in conjunction with the Associated Student Speakers Program. Today we have with us a distinguished alumnus, and directly following his speech we'll be moving into the men's lounge for an informal give-and-take question-and-answer coffee hour. In the absence of our Chancellor, who is, if you read the Bruin today, snowed in, we have our acting Chancellor, Mr. Foster Sherwood, to give the introduction.
First of all, of course, I bring the Chancellor's regrets at his inability to be with you this noon, and I have reason to believe that our speaker will view with sympathy, indeed with understanding, the reason for his absence, since, as some of you may have read, our speaker himself was snowed in recently. Our speaker is not a native of Los Angeles, but one whom I like to think is finding Los Angeles a second home. He was born in Detroit and educated in Albuquerque and then in Los Angeles. He graduated here at UCLA in the class of 1927. He went on to take graduate work, an MA and a PhD at Harvard University, and then in a postdoctoral experience, he went on for further work at Northwestern, at the London School of Economics, and at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He is a student of political science, international relations, anthropology, and has written in all of these areas. But more important for our purposes today, he is a practitioner in these areas as well. During World War II, he was in the Office of Strategic Services as the chief of the African section of the OSS. In 1944, he went with the State Department, and since those experiences has played a key role in the center of world events. He was at Dumbarton Oaks, at San Francisco, at London, in the first General Assembly of the United Nations in 1946. The following year, he moved to the United Nations from the U.S. State Department, where he has been ever since. Those of you who have read recent history will have many times run across his name playing a key role in the Suez Crisis, in the Congo, in Cyprus, and of course, perhaps most notably, in Palestine in 1949 and 50. He is a Nobel laureate. He is a good friend of this institution, and it is after him that our social science building is named. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ralph Bunche.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sherwood, Mr. Mark, members of the UCLA community. Perhaps one day, Mr. Sherwood, I'll come to be known as Waffle Bunche. It's rather euphonious. Very happy to have this opportunity to come back to my alma mater, to UCLA. It's always good to come to Westwood, and as a confirmed Easterner now, I have to say it's always good also to come back to California. There's one distinguishing characteristic of Californians that anyone who lives in the East very long always notes, and I had an illustration of it last night on the plane coming out here from New York. There was a stewardess on the plane who was particularly spry and sprightly and full of gab, and who also wore a semi-mini skirt rather well, and she was very friendly, and at dinner she served a wine, and she came and asked if I'd have some more, and I said, no thanks, and she said, it's very good wine, don't you like it? And I just said, van ordinaire, même très ordinaire, put that domestic, and she said, what did you say? And I said, oh, it's quite ordinary wine, probably domestic wine. And she turned a little unpleasant then. She said, why don't you get off? And I said, then I said, what did you say? And I said, get off. Just a while ago, the pilot announced that he was going up to 39,000 feet to get away from the turbulence. And I said, as I calculate that, that's a long jump. That's 3 times 13,000 feet. And she said, oh, and so you're superstitious, too. But it was all in fun. I'm especially happy to be here under the auspices of the UCLA Associated Students Program, and to be again in this hall at a noon lecture. I was sorry I wasn't here yesterday when my good friend Hubert Humphrey was here. Hubert and I have known each other well for many years, going back to the years when we were both teaching political science in universities. He's back at it. I gather that that wasn't his first choice, but I understand he said yesterday that he was talking about the domestic situation yesterday, and I would be talking about the international situation today. But as it turns out, I'm going to talk very little about the international situation today, and talk mainly about one particular aspect of the domestic situation, the racial problem. I want to say at the outset that I speak only for myself. I'm not speaking as an official of the United Nations, not expressing any official UN view, though the UN record on race particularly and the equality of peoples is excellent, beyond reproach. And but I'm not speaking either as a spokesman for my race, because I have no such position, no such right. I'm talking only as a layman, a black layman who has been a Negro for now 64 and a half years, which is fairly long. I must say that I'm always awed when I come back to Westwood. You know, I graduated from UCLA on the old Vermont Avenue campus. They were just beginning to build this campus at the time of my graduation in June 1927. And I'm always struck by the the growth of this institution, in the size of the campus, the number of buildings, and the huge student population here, in how different it must be now from my days on the Vermont Avenue campus, which I was reminded of this morning at breakfast in Hedrick Hall when I looked out the window and saw Reber Hall, Charles Reber, who was one of my teachers, who I must say was one of the finest teachers I ever had, one of the finest men I've ever known, one of the most interesting personalities. And this was back in the days when if you were a student at UCLA, you knew every professor in the institution by his first name and knew most of the students. And when you had the free run of professors, you just drop in on them at any time and sit around and chew the fat. I used to do that. Dean Reber, who always held open house, he had a rather strange custom of keeping sayings on these dividers from shredded wheat boxes. He had files and files of these boxes, and I used to marvel at the fact that he ate so much shredded wheat. Some of those sayings on those folders weren't very profound either. One of them I remember he always used to cite was, cooperation means doing what I tell you to do. But he didn't really mean it. But mentioning him, I can't help but recall that one of the occasions I dropped in to talk to him, I wanted some help. And I said, I've been asked to do the commencement speech, and I've got to find a topic, and I can't think of anything. Oh, he said, get something that will mellow you. He said, here. He reached up on his shelf and he pulled down a volume of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poems. And he said, go down to the beach at Santa Monica and read these poems and find a subject from there. Well, I took his advice. I took the volume of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poems. I went down to Santa Monica. I was able, without too much difficulty, to find a co-ed who would go down with me. I had to have somebody to hold the book. And I read these poems occasionally down there, and I came back with a subject for the speech. I went in to see Dean Reber. I told him, I've got it. He said, well, what is it? I said, it's the fourth dimension of personality. He said, fine. I don't know what it is, but it's fine. And so I did an essay on the fourth dimension of personality. I delivered it finally on commencement day. And afterwards, several people came up to me and said, oh, it sounded fine. But what was it about? What were you saying? And I had to tell them, well, I'll be damned if I know. But that was in 1927, and I haven't found out yet what that meant. But that's the way it was in those days, and they were very good days. Well, there was a time not so long ago when I used to wish to come to campuses in order to get away from the strife and turmoil that's characteristic of the UN. But as I go around these days, I find that there's little difference. There's very little contrast between many of the campuses which I visit and the United Nations. We have demonstrations in common on the campuses and at UN. We have a better organized system of demonstrations at the UN than most campuses do. We have demonstration grounds right across the street from the UN, where anybody who wants to picket in the organization can apply for a permit and to the police and can picket for so many hours on so many people and such subject. And we get groups out there regularly, particularly in good weather. We're approaching the peak of the picketing season next month. But last fall we had one unusually interesting picketing experience. There were some young ladies, rather comely and shapely, who had a picket line and were marching around with their placards in this picket area. And then all of a sudden they all disrobed, and I mean completely disrobed. And they continued to parade around with their signs until the police approached, and then they hastily threw dresses over their heads and ran away. But when it was over, we were trying to find out just what they were picketing about, who were they representing. And we were never able to find anybody who ever saw what was on those placards. So we still don't know what that was about. Well, on the campuses, there's ferment, there's dissent expressed in activism, in involvement, and on the whole, I think this is good. Presidents don't, of course. Just yesterday at the UN, we had at lunch Salvador Lopez, who is a veteran diplomat at the United Nations from the Philippines, and until a few weeks ago had been the Philippine permanent representative at the UN. And then General Carlos Romulo resigned as president of the University of the Philippines to become foreign minister, and Lopez was appointed to succeed him. And Lopez told us yesterday at lunch that at the end of his first week as president of the University of the Philippines, he was presented by a delegation of students with 77 demands. And he thought perhaps it might not be a bad idea to come back to the UN, because he could see real trouble ahead. Well, as a former teacher myself, I can think back to the 30s when we were in the classroom constantly trying to break down the complacency of students, their acceptance of regimentation, their isolation from the community, their willingness to be in an ivory tower. And I can recall that at Howard University in Washington in the 30s, I would myself take groups of students down to get on picket lines. I remember one time we were picketing a governor's conference in Washington because they refused to include the item of lynching on the agenda. We took a group of students down to get into the protest. We did everything we could to try to break down this isolation from the community. Now the pendulum has swung the other way, sometimes painfully, but in balance, I think it's a good thing. Though obviously, you can't have expressions of active interest without occasional excesses, which may be unfortunate. And when we think of the world, the kind of world we're living in, it's inevitable that there would be this ferment and dissent. It's an inadequate world in so many ways, intolerable wrongs, long-standing injustices of many kinds, dangers in many places. For example, we run over the fundamental problems confronting this world today. The fact that it's a world sharply divided between an overwhelming majority of people who are the have-nots, who know misery as a way of life, a daily way of life, and the affluent few, the haves. A world in which overpopulation is a constant threat, with an assurance of the population of the world doubling by the end of this century, that is, within the next 30 years. Famine conditions in large parts of the world imminent. The sword of Damocles in the form of the nuclear holocaust hanging over all the world. Racism rampant in southern Africa, in our own country, and a mad arms race involving the expenditure of astronomical sums for arms, which the two superstates, the U.S. and the USSR, dare not use because they would destroy each other with them. We know that a secure peace requires the eradication of these evils, but the effort and the pace toward this eradication is far too meager and slow, and that there must be a greater involvement of governments, a greater sense of urgency of governments about these problems is clear to everyone. Well, now finally, on the international scene, has the United Nations failed? That question in different words was put to me just a while ago in the press conference. Well, it's failed in one sense. It's failed to live up to the expectations which many of us had, but many of these expectations were unrealistic, were set too high. But in the basic sense, the UN has not failed, because its primary purpose is to save the world, to avoid the fatal and fateful nuclear war, and that it has done. The answer then to the question, has the UN failed, is that no, it has not, because we are all still here. Well, now, as I indicated at the beginning, my natural inclination in a talk here would be to dwell on the international scene, on the Middle East, on Vietnam, on Africa, on the current Berlin crisis. But instead of that, I'm going to emphasize from now on, this morning, the crisis of race in the United States. And I'm doing so quite deliberately, because I am firmly convinced that there is no problem confronting this country which is more vital to the future of the country, to the well-being of all the people of this country, than the problem of the conflict between black and white, which is an accentuating conflict. Now, I by no means mean to minimize the threat to the peace of the world posed by the Vietnam War or by the Middle East conflict. This Vietnam War, which we got into, which we stumbled into, in fact, got into by a series of stumbles, and we have found that it's much easier to stumble into a war than to get out of one. And now we're banking heavily, almost entirely, on the outcome of the Paris talks. It's very clear that they're going to be long, tortuous, but I have confidence that they finally will produce positive results. I have a personal interest in that outcome because my only son was reached by the long finger of Uncle Sam, and he's in the service, and I'd be happy if he could escape Vietnam. On the Middle East, this is the most dangerous threat to the peace of the world existing today. It involves the toughest combination of conflicting claims, of historical wrongs, of emotions, of great power rivalries and maneuvers. And I must say here that I'm personally very sorry about the unexpected and untimely death of Levi Eshkol, the Prime Minister of Israel, a man whom I've known for a good many years, a very wise, a very fine man, very human and kindly man with a lively sense of humor. Well, in the Middle East, we don't have the Paris talks, but we have the Yaring mission, Gunnar Yaring, and he's just gone back out to the Middle East. He arrived in Cyprus last evening, and with the backing of the United Nations, the hope is that ultimately he will achieve a breakthrough and find a solution to the relatively few, half dozen major issues, problems confronting the Middle East. This is possible. But I repeat that there's no greater threat to the security of this nation than that in the growing conflict between white and black here at home. Now, you will have noted perhaps that I had a strange title for this talk, which was for whites only, Racism, Road to Ruin. Well, I did that quite deliberately because I wanted to underline the fact that the nature of this problem is such that if one is engaging in missionary work on it, as I suppose I am, then as all missionaries must, one goes to and talks primarily to the heathen. And that's I could make a companion talk to this one for whites mainly, which I could call for blacks only. The do-it-yourself black revolution. I won't get diverted into that right now, except to say that it's obvious that this black revolution can be won only if there is unity of purpose amongst black people, and certainly it cannot be won if black people go about bumping each other off for one reason or another. There's no one that I know who has all the answers to that revolution, or who can talk very authoritatively about its tactics and its principles. But there is a revolution underway, and it comes about because of a number of factors. There's the ever-present racial division in this country, which is widening fatefully, I think. And why is this the case? Well, what are the basic facts, the reasons? That must, in my view, be recognized and faced up to by this society if there is to be any hope for a solution of this number one American domestic problem. First of all, the fact that racism is widespread in the society. It is a widespread malignancy. It afflicts a great many people who don't even know it, who do not realize that they are racist in one way or another, who have never had their racist attitudes diagnosed. I can say this advisedly because I live in New York City, which is undoubtedly the most advanced city in terms of liberalism, racial contact in the country, I believe. But the races in New York City are almost completely separate and distinct. There's no integration in New York City. The two societies live separately. There may be, at one function or another, a token Negro representation, but there's no communion between them. They, for the most part, live in separate residential areas. There's contact during the working day, but when the working day is over, they go to in their respective directions, and that's all the contact there is. There's nothing that could be called integration. Thirdly, the black American has always, in this dual society, and it has always been a dual society, I repeat, been deprived, discriminated against, refused and rejected. Rejected in the sense of never being accepted in the mainstream of American life, never being accepted, actually, on a basis of equality with others. Fourthly, there is the rapidly increasing ghettoization of the black American. The congregation of the black citizens in the so-called inner cities of the North, and incidentally, the ghetto is no longer just a phenomenon of the great urban communities of New York and Chicago and Detroit and St. Louis. There are ghettos developing in many places in suburban cities. In New York, for example, there are ghettos growing up in suburban areas such as White Plains and Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, that have been little noticed, and they're following the same pattern as in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant and the like. So that this has brought about a crisis stage in relations between the races in the country. And five, there's no more toleration on the part of the black man of inferior status, of a denial of human and group rights, racial rights. The black American will no longer buy the lollipop of conditions are better or progress is being made. He's not likely to be believing, and certainly never grateful about statements from white Americans that racial progress is being made. He no longer has any fear. He no longer can be intimidated. He's everywhere searching for identity He's searching for, demanding status, recognition, acceptance. And this is the crux of the black revolution. It's found in the changed, not the changing, but the changed attitude of the black man himself. Now, in his relations with the white community, there's a very deplorable lack of understanding, and therefore a lack of communication, because there can't be any communication unless there is understanding. But the lack of understanding is a lack on the part of the white population to understand what is in the mind of the black man and why. And this accounts for the breakdown in communication. There has been always in this society lip service paid to the ideals, particularly by liberal white Americans. But, and it has, there's been some progress under the process of gradualism. But that's played out now. It can't be used anymore. It's not acceptable to black men. And for the simple reason that time has played it out. You see, it's been almost 200 years since the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of this country promised equality for all of its citizens. And that's a long time. It's been 100 years since the emancipation of the black man. And if you think in terms of that many years, then progress loses meaning. Because if the only progress that can have meaning now would be achievement completely of the goal of full acceptance and equality. And so in consequence there has been a growing frustration amongst blacks, a bitterness, cynicism, sometimes approaching nihilism in its character and intensity, complete dissatisfaction with the physical conditions of the ghettos, and which have become blacker and blacker, and there has been a constant assault on the dignity and the self-respect of the black man. And so more and more one finds, particularly in the ghettos, a rejection of integration as a reality. They see it as a false promise, as a snare and a delusion, and there's a tendency to turn to separatism, which is an expression of complete reliance because of this disillusionment about the promise of integration. You see, if you are a black man living in a northern ghetto today, under the current conditions, every waking moment you have to say to yourself, well, why am I here? And the answer is that you're here because you have not been accepted in the white society. You're not accepted in the white society. And then the inevitable, ultimate conclusion is that, all right, I'm not accepted in the white society, I'm rejected by it, but then they cannot expect to continue to control my destiny and reject me too. And then I will undertake to control my own destiny. I will rely on my own devices, my own unity, my own power. And this, in a nutshell, is what is happening. Because the black man there looks at the establishments and he sees that these are always mainly white. This is what, for example, the to-do in New York City about decentralization is all about. the black community of Bedford-Stuyvesant for years was pleading with the Board of Education, with the city, for relief from intolerable education conditions, boys and girls graduating from high school not being able to read and write, and getting no relief. And finally, they demanded to control it themselves. Well, now, New York City has more than 60% of its students in public schools black and Puerto Rican, but only 90% of the teachers, more than 90% of the teachers and 95% of the administrators in the New York public school system are white. This is a step, actually. It's not just an educational problem. It's an effort on the part of the black community to assume control of its own destiny. And all of this is really the genesis of black power, with its emphasis on racial pride, on unity, on self-respect and self-reliance. And the root cause, of course, of all this is to be found in the attitudes of the white community. The fact that there are lifelong wounds which every black American carries with him. I don't care where he is in the country or who he is. If you see a black man, you see a severely wounded man, a man who has been battered and buffeted by racism, who has endured racial slurs, overt racial insults, humiliations of many kinds, and who carries this with him, unforgettable memories. I do myself. I could detail, although I've had a good life and I've had many boons and many good things have happened to me in this society still, I could go back to my early childhood and remember almost every slur, insult, humiliation I've suffered. I could run right down the line. I could spend a long time telling about them. Just as an example, for instance, I had an excellent time at UCLA, which from the beginning took a very fair stand on problems affecting the black members of the student body. And certainly far more good things happened to me here than the bad things. But the memories that are most unforgettable have to do with some racially bad things. I had a good friend, for example, back in around 25, 26, Negro Leon Whitaker, who was a very fine boxer. In fact, he had become Pacific Coast lightweight boxing champion in the Pacific Coast Conference. And in that day, Stanford did not admit Negro students, and also had a policy of not engaging in sports which involved direct individual contact between black and white athletes. And a boxing match was scheduled between UCLA and Stanford here in Los Angeles. And the Stanford coach came down with his all-white team and talked to the UCLA boxing coach, suckered him, I suppose, and told him what his situation was, and induced the UCLA coach to substitute a UCLA white boxer for Whitaker. And of course, the UCLA white boxer had the stuffings beaten out of him by the Stanford boy, which the UCLA students didn't like, and they protested. That was one of the early demonstrations here. They marched on Chancellor Moore's, Provost Moore, I guess it was, office the next morning, and bulletins came out that day announcing the policy of UCLA as being equality and fairness to all groups. And I think this boxing coach was fired. I remember, as a political science major, being kept out of the UCLA Political Science Association because somebody blackballed me because of race. Well, these kind of things never fade from one's memory, and this is something that all white people must recognize. Of course, as one grows older, these things become less important or sometimes amusing. Not so long ago, I was invited to a dinner at the home of Trygve Lie, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and I sat next to a woman who was an American wedded to a Scandinavian, and she got talking with me about various things, and we got on the subject of race, and it suddenly became apparent to me that she had not assumed that I was an American Negro, or I wouldn't be at this dinner, because it was for royalty, and so I must be some swarthy person from some faraway country, Egypt or something. And so she started talking very frankly, and I led her on rather devilishly, and we got on race and found she was from the South, and finally, in exasperation, she said to me, I'd been citing anthropology books and biology and philosophers and everything but the Bible. And finally, in exasperation, she said to me, oh, I've heard all of that before, but I don't believe that. Now, tell me, do you have a family? I said, yes. Do you have daughters? Yes. Well, would you wish your daughters to marry a Negro? And then Providence came to my rescue. I'm seldom without words, as you see. I mean, I can too long-winded, but Providence put just exactly the right answer into my mouth. And I said to her very calmly, well, my dear lady, I couldn't possibly object, because you see their mother did. And she was later heard to say to somebody that when she found out who and what I was, that she wasn't going to any more of these affairs unless somebody briefed her on who was going to be there. Well, I must conclude. What's the outlook? First of all, people always asking, especially white people, well, where are the moderates? Where are the voices of the moderates in this situation? The point is that the moderates, the voices are largely stilled because there isn't anything convincing about the prospect of reaching the goal, which they can say to the depressed black resident of the ghettos, for example. What promise can they give that has meaning? And so, in my view, there's only one way to avoid what I believe will be utter catastrophe in this country, and that's to undertake a massive effort, a massive mobilization of will, of resources, determination, on a war scale, to break the back of racism in this country, which is, after all, the cause of all the trouble, which is the evil. It would have to be, in effect, a war planned, organized, determined, against racism, as we are waging a war in Vietnam. I believe that if that sort of effort were put forth on anything like the scale of the war in Vietnam, in terms of determination and resources, in terms of any substantial fraction, for example, of the $30 billion a year we're spending in Vietnam to protect the liberties of the Vietnamese, then there would be a chance to avert the disastrous, or to reverse the disastrous course which is now being followed in this country. And I don't think anything less than that will do it. I don't think that palliatives are going to do it. You can shine up ghettos, make them shiny, but they're still ghettos, and all the underlying evils are there. The pathology of the ghetto will remain the same. Shiny ghettos will erupt and burn just as readily as shabby ones. This is what the country has to do, in my view. It has to remember that if there is a permanently dual society here, it will be a permanently separate but unequal society which has seeds of greater conflict than we have at the present time. In other words, there will be an accentuation of the conflict situation, which I think is bound to occur anyhow when the black veterans begin to come back in numbers from Vietnam. There will be, of course, if there's increasing trouble, there will be increasing emphasis on law and order, with decreasing emphasis on justice, and this will mean an intensification of conflict, which could invoke police methods, police-state methods, which could ultimately indeed lead us into a virtual police state which would be disastrous for everybody, white as well as black. And finally, I could say just one word about my own stand in this situation. My stand is simply this. I'm proud to be black. I'm proud to be an American in a society which I would like to see a whole lot better than it is. But it is my society, and I say my society and my land because my forebears and I myself helped to build it and put energy, sweat, tears, and often blood and lives into building it. I have a stake in it. And my view is that I'm determined to have that stake in full, to protect it in full, and to put it simply and a bit impolitely, I intend to fight like hell to achieve it and to preserve it because it's mine. And I would not under any circumstances ever think of running away from that fight. Well, I'm sorry to have taken so much of your time. I'll be glad to answer questions of those who wish to go into the other room.
We're all inviting. Recognize you, and
stand so they can
if you would stand and say it loud enough, it would be easier if we wouldn't have to repeat. Why don't we start here?
Yes?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Would I be useful to the UN?
As a which?
A Hebrew major.
Well, that's an interesting question. It's not an official working language, but just this week, as a matter of fact, I had a document, Israeli Gazette, a particular law that I needed to study the text of, and tried to find, because we have many Jewish members of the staff, secretariat, and I tried to find someone who could translate this from the Hebrew. It was in the official Jewish Gazette and only in Hebrew. And when I left, they still had not found for me anyone in the 4,000 members of the UN Secretariat who knew Hebrew well enough. Some of them could speak it, but who knew it well enough to make an authoritative translation of Hebrew legal text in an official gazette. And they said they would probably have to go outside the Secretariat to hire someone as a consultant to do this translation job. So we could have used you this week.
Yes, right here.
How do you stand on the admission of Red China into the UN?
That, I should say, is a universal question. Well, first of all, let me straighten it out. You see, there is no question of the admission of Red China. There is a question of who sits for China. China, as a state, is a charter member of the UN. Up till now, as you know, the representatives of nationalist China, Chiang Kai-shek, have always been given the seats. Now, this isn't just an academic question. It's a very important question in terms of the UN as to whether it is an admission question or a credentials question, who sits. Because, you see, if it were to be an admission question, then the charter procedure would apply, whereby for a new state to be admitted, there must be first a recommendation by the Security Council where the veto is, and where the representatives of nationalist China are sitting with the veto. And so that's ruled out immediately, you see, because you could never get such an action through the Security Council, because it would be vetoed by nationalist China, if not by anybody else. But a credentials question comes by a vote in the General Assembly and the Security Council with no veto applying. And you may recall that about 4 years ago, the support for the seating of Peking, the representatives of Communist China, on what we call the prior question, as to whether this is an important question which requires 2/3 or can be dealt with by a simple majority vote. The vote on that was 47 to 47. Since then, the support for the People's Republic of China has diminished, largely because of the lack of fervor for it by the Soviet Union and India, so that at the present time, the chief supporter of who takes the lead in on the question of seating the representatives of Communist China is Albania. And if you need help in the UN, you can do better than Albania. But from our standpoint, you ask my view, I definitely believe, well, first of all, that the UN cannot ever hope to achieve its maximum potential unless there's universality in membership. So with over 700 million people without a voice in the UN, unrepresented, means that the UN is bound to be much weaker than it should be. And I believe that if Communist China had been in the UN in these last 10 years particularly, the world might be much different. I think the whole Vietnam situation might have been avoided in terms of the crisis war stage that it reached. But now China has been kept out. The lead in keeping them out, as you know, was U.S. policy. And they have become, in effect, mavericks, acting like mavericks do in any society or in any herd. And that's particularly bad for the world in view of the fact that China has demonstrated now a capacity to turn out nuclear devices and even a hydrogen bomb, with no restraint from the international community at all, you see, which is a danger to the whole world. That's
Excuse me, can you all hear in the back of the room? No?
No, I'm sorry.
Just hold on.
I'll have to suck this thing.
Fine, right over here.
Yeah. Well, as I said, what I was saying was that I could foresee the danger that if this present trend is not reversed by the sort of massive effort that would be required to do so, that there would be more and more violent activity in the cities, which would lead to more and more emphasis on law and order and less emphasis on justice along with law and order. Nobody's against law and order, but it's not law and order alone. It's law and order in connection with justice, and that process could lead to intensified police efforts to put down violence, which could reach such a peak that we could face the danger of becoming a police state, which I thought would then be disastrous for the entire population, whatever its color.
Yes, right over here.
Dr. Bunche,
Did I come through on that? Yeah.
Black nationalists in this country take a position that the United States, and in particular the white man in the United States, the white man in the Western world, do not have the capacity to change or to begin to do the things that you outlined in your speech a few minutes ago. And their assumption is that since they do not have the ability to change nor the desire, that all that's left for black people to do is to prepare to make revolution and to try to destroy the United States and help the rest of the third world hopefully destroy Western European power. Based upon that assumption, many of the black student unions in this country have been developing. What is your opinion of that position? How do you feel?
Yes, I'm familiar with that. Well, in the first place, I would not describe that as black nationalism. I think I mentioned it in my talk, a cynicism and a desperation, actually, and a resignation which amounts to nihilism. I'd call that black nihilism, not black nationalism, because black nationalism would mean that the aspiration was to establish a black state, a nation, based on color, which I think is a dubious basis for establishing a nation, and particularly in terms of establishing a nation out of what is the most affluent and the most powerful militarily and nation in the world, in fact, in human history. And I think I said somewhere in my talk that, which was quite rambling and trying to get more than I could into the limited time, that this would mean that you'd have a permanently separate society here, but which would be not only permanently separate, but permanently grossly unequal, which could only lead to more conflict, because you can't have that kind of condition for very long without intensified conflict. This is the way I see. I say that my line is, as you could gather from what I've said, is to do what I can to get the white population of the country to realize what is at stake, to understand what is going on in the minds of the grievously wounded black people of the country, and to develop some understanding of what the unthinkable consequences will be if they don't undertake the effort necessary to break through on this problem. I don't see. I've never been able really to understand the motivations of nihilism, whether it was in old Tsarist Russia or anywhere else, and I don't understand it here because I don't see what's to be gained for anyone in pursuing a course of what amounts to suicide, whether for white or black. And possibly because I have what might be called an abiding faith, which is a word which only a 64-year-old square could use, not in necessarily the goodness of people, but that the common practical sense of people, when the chips are down and when they I've seen in my life too many instances of how people change when they see what their interests are, and when they see that the course that they're following is a disastrous one. And I don't think it's impossible for this society or any other society to change in order to avert ruination. This is my line of thinking.
Yes.
Dr. Bunche,
Yes.
have you read, and if so, or if you haven't, would you recommend Dr. Martin Luther King's book of gospel sermons, Strength to Love? Because I think this is what is really lacking, an understanding of the biblical doctrine that all men are created from one forefather, and also the fact that we do need to have divine help to love others as we should. Have you read this book, and would you recommend?
Oh yes, and certainly I would recommend reading, but I wouldn't say to anybody that when you read it, you must think that you've found the solution. I loved actually Martin Luther. I think he was I knew him well. I've marched with him. I think he was a remarkable man. He had many Christ-like attributes. But you see, in this, I've been always hard-headed in this problem. I think brotherly love and brotherhood, all this business is good. You know, it's a good ideal. But I just don't see people as ready for it, and that doesn't mean that then there's no hope for mankind, because in this racial situation, I don't think it's necessary for whites and blacks to love each other, or all blacks to love each other, and all whites to love each other. Hell, I know a lot of blacks I wouldn't be seen dead with, and many more whites. But what I think is that all that is needed is a sensible willingness on the part of people to have extend mutual respect to each other. You see, we don't have to go to the length of brotherly love, which may come to pass some day. But I'm afraid it's going to be a long way off, and we don't have that much time. And if there's simply willingness on the part of all people to accept each individual on the basis of his merit, his worth, without hanging on him the handicap of his color and hair texture and features and all the shibboleths and taboos that are purely man-made and artificial and historical, as mores are in their roots, we can coexist. And so I would say, fine. But when Martin was being the preacher, which he was, and a great preacher, and a very persuasive one, in these sermons, and that's what you do on Sunday morning. But the rest of the week, Martin was out there marching, and he wasn't preaching brotherly love so much in those marches. He was trying to, he was taking a much more hard-headed approach in many ways. Yes.
Will you comment on Malcolm X's advocation of black people going before the United Nations in the name of human rights rather than in the name of civil rights?
Well,
did you all hear that? Excuse me.
Yes. Would you want to? Would you repeat it? Yes.
I want to ask you to comment on.
Look, here, step over here. Take the mic.
So everybody okay?
Will you comment upon Malcolm X's advocation of black people going before the United Nations in the name of human rights rather than in the name of civil rights?
Well, the reason Malcolm X did that is because of the UN Charter, because the UN Charter has specific provisions on human rights rather than civil rights, because civil rights are domestic, you see. And there's a Human Rights Commission, and the specific provisions of the Charter relating to human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, in her years at the UN, devoted herself almost exclusively to the development of the Declaration on Human Rights and the later Covenant on Human Rights. So you had a specific instrument to appeal to there, and that was the basis for that strategy.
Fine, right over here.
But in practice, there's no difference between human rights and civil rights action.
I have a question on the Mideast situation.
Yes. It's still there.
I'd like you to comment on what to me appears to be a part of an amount of hypocrisy on the Secretary General's part, in that after the recent attack on the airline in Zurich, he asked Israel not to do anything, but made almost no comment, asking the Arab nations to control the guerrillas themselves. I wonder I'd like you to comment. This seems to me to be quite uneven-handed.
Well,
it doesn't seem to would lead to any settlement in the area.
Well, it would if you, in the way you put it, yes. But you see, you have not told the full story. The Secretary General has on numerous occasions publicly denounced the acts of the guerrillas and the terrorists, and so have members of the Security Council. The Secretary General here was doing what he had to do, namely to call attention, first denouncing. You said you hadn't denounced the acts of the guerrillas. In the statement you're referring to,
What I said is he hasn't asked the Arab
let me finish. In this statement, he denounced in clear, strong, unqualified terms this kind of act of terrorism. Then, as his duty as the Secretary General of the United Nations, because of the widespread assumption that there would be military retaliation, U Thant called attention to the government of Israel. Indeed, he appealed to the government of Israel in the light of the Security Council's own denunciation of the Beirut air raid, not to resort to acts of another act of retaliation, because he knew that this would not in any sense help the situation, but actually only accentuate it, aggravate it, and he knew that this would unquestionably lead to another Security Council denunciation, which would certainly not be in the interest of Israel. But it is, but now then you go on to say that he has said nothing to the Arab governments. That you're not in position to say, but the things which the Secretary General says to one government or another are privileged and often cannot be divulged without losing their effectiveness. And I'll give you a case in point. At the before the executions in Baghdad, the first group occurred, the Secretary General, having learned of the prospective sentences and executions, called in the representative of Iraq and asked him to convey to his government. That representative has since resigned, Pachachi. Asked him to, this was on the 13th of January, in fact, asked him to convey to his government the Secretary General's deep concern and his hope that these executions would not be performed because of the effect that this would have upon the situation in the Middle East, upon peace, upon the Army mission, and so on. The next morning, through a leak that I cannot elaborate on public, this occurred in the New York Times in the worst possible way, so that it destroyed the effectiveness of the Secretary General's action completely, made it abortive. It said, the piece said that in pursuance of a demand made by the representative of the government of Israel, the Secretary General had called in the representative of Iraq to do these things. Well, in the first place, that wasn't true. In the second place, it ensured automatically a negative reaction on the part of Iraq. So you must bear in mind that a person in the position of the Secretary General has to use a very considerable amount of discretion and judgment as to what he says and does not say publicly in terms of his approaches to governments, unless he wants simply to be in the press and have no effect.
Yes.
Dr. Bunche, you talked about the desirability of and assuming the end of the Vietnam War, of diverting some of the monies that are being spent there to try to eradicate the racism that exists in the country. What do you view as being the political, economic interest of this country being willing to do that, to try to resolve the racist issues?
Well, I think that is the question. I frankly don't see the signs of that kind of determination as yet, and I don't think there is a deep enough appreciation, realization on the part of the American public at all levels, on the part of governments and institutions, as to just what can happen here in this situation. I think, although we're, in my view, at a very dangerous crisis, I think there's been no domestic crisis of this magnitude since the Civil War. But I think this is a very great danger. And I, quite frankly, in answer to your question, don't see that kind of will being mobilized. But it's teasing, because if you think of what, I suppose a lot of people here could sit down and work out a blueprint for an attack on racism in this country if you had something in the neighborhood of $30 billion to play with. You could do quite an elaborate blueprint for that. But you can't see the prospect of it right now.
December 7th, 1968, there was a human rights conference at UCLA, at which time Dr. Abraham Kaplan, former chairman of the Department of Philosophy, gave a talk with other people in honor of the United Nations, at which time he discussed the human right to be biased and to discriminate. And at this point, he was talking about the Far Eastern countries and their right to have their own cultures. For instance, India. He is an expert on India and Japan, and he made the mention of the fact that each country should have the human right to have a caste system if they so wish. And the United States and no other country in the world has any right, any human right, to tell another country how to have their own form of government.
Mm-hmm.
And when he said the human right to be biased and discriminate did not mean prejudice. There is a difference between bias and prejudice, and you can be biased in a positive way and prejudiced in a negative way. And I handed you a message.
Well, what you're saying is, as I gather, that he was saying that this is not an international question, it's a domestic question.
Nations have no right to tell anyone how to
Well,
run a country, is what he was saying.
the United Nations has not attempted to do that.
That's what he was trying to say.
But did he also go on to say that the government of India has taken a very strong stand on it and has had a program for years to eliminate the caste system? And
But you're talking about human rights.
yes, but you got to bear this in mind. There's a difference between overt United Nations interference and what is the inevitable influence of an organized international community. And so a country like India or a country like the United States has to be responsive to the views of the rest of the world. And so the views of the rest of the world looking on the racial situation in the United States has an effect. Let me tell you, it isn't being debated in the councils of the United Nations, but every representative of the United States in the United Nations is very sensitive about what the rest of the world is thinking.
I just want to make the point.
And you that's it.
Everybody is biased in their own way.
We have time for about 2 more questions. We take this one and this one over here.
Yes, Dr. Bunche, you don't see the will, as you put it, for the amount of investment to be put into the ghettos, black communities, brown communities in this country. What would you suggest to students who also see this lack of will and who take to the streets to show it, American people aware of it? Now, it seems to me that the only resources blacks, browns, and left outs have is violence or the threat of it these days. And it seems to me that if the change is going to come, it has to become more and more, apparent to people in high places that unless the changes are made, there's going to be, a lot of, heavy, hot action going on.
Well, I think that's true. That I think I said that we can look forward to much more trouble in this country. I think, as a matter of fact, the eruptions that have occurred in the ghettos thus far have been relatively small. They've been unorganized. They've been spontaneous. There's been no planning in them, anything of the kind. They've just broken out. But I could see planned eruptions in the future if the present trend continues. And this is my fear, because this was implicit in my title. Racism, Road to Ruin. That's what I believe.
Get off the road. Where would you stand?
Yeah, get off the road. That's right.
What is your opinion? Like, you look at violence today, and the president condemns it. Ronald Reagan says more cops.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mention him, but may I say you read me. That's the point.
Now, this is brought out especially in Mississippi, for instance, that still there hasn't been any significant progress.
No, there I would disagree with you.
Segregation.
No, there I disagree with you. You see, the irony of it is that despite all of these laws, the intensification of the civil rights struggle, the first time, in this last decade, national legislation and so on, the condition of the black man in the northern urban centers, in the ghettos, has worsened. There has been, using this nasty word, progress. There has been some progress in a superficial sense in the South. Do you realize that even in some places in Mississippi or Alabama today, there's more integration in the schools than there is in Southside Chicago or in Harlem or Bedford-Stuyvesant? The black man in the South, it's why you get much more eruption in the North these days than in the South, because they have seen some of the overt symbols of discrimination, of deprivation, and so on removed. They could see that there is some change, whereas the black man in the North has seen the change only for the worse.
But it seems like it only amounts to like somebody throwing pennies to a pauper.
Yes. Well, do you remember what I said? I said that when you think in terms of 200 years of promises unfulfilled, use of the word progress loses all meaning.
Well, how do you suggest then you would go about changing people's
Well, first of all, the black man has to unite as he never has been before, to do all that he can to make an impact upon the attitude of the white community, and the white community, on its part, has to realize what the stakes are. And in the final analysis, the decision will rest there.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it's good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.